Hey everyone, welcome back to Soundproof. I know we've had a little bit of a break recently and we will address that in just a second, but just wanted to say quickly that this is our 1 year anniversary, so thank you guys so much for sticking around with us for a year and letting us talk your ears off. Me and Brendan, still really enjoy making this podcast, and our recent break is not indicative of our motivation or anything, so don't worry. But we have a really important episode for you today. This is something that we both feel very strongly about, and we just wanted to kind of start a conversation, well, more continue a conversation that has been happening elsewhere. So we hope you enjoy. We hope you get something out of it. And again, thanks for sticking with us.
Hey trainers, and thanks for joining us, thanks for sticking with us, thanks for coming back, thanks to us for being back. We've been out for quite a while here, but we do have a really special episode planned this week, which is part of the reason that we've had such a long hiatus. And Jake, feel free to jump in at any point here as I continue to talk, but there's a lot that's going on in the world right now, to put it lightly, and especially this week as it pertains to the gaming community. With all sorts of, the things going on as far as Black Lives Matter, a lot of the sexual abuse allegations that have come out in the gaming community over the past week, the past 48 hours even. So there's a lot going on, and Jake and I, for the last couple of weeks, have felt very strongly about wanting to use the platform, however limited it is, to try and be allies to a lot of these marginalized groups that are that need our help right now. So that's really the goal of our episode this week. And Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as far as our little hiatus goes, that was mostly on me. I will go ahead and say that. I've been somewhat busy finishing up kind of the tail end of my master's degree, and that should be done in the next month and a half, which is terrifying, but kind of cool. But yeah, like Brendan said, I think we both just felt really strongly about what's been going on in the world recently, and we figured, we have a chance to talk about it where people might listen to at least a little bit of it, so we may as well. And that's why we're back.
Right. So this week, we're joined by two very special guests, two people that are good friends of Jake and mine, and both people that are, very connected to a lot of, the social justice causes that are going on in the world right now. So we are this week joined by Chalkey Horenstein and Gabby Snyder. So I'm going to start with Gabby real quick, if you want to just take a minute to introduce yourself, Gabby.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Gabby. I am a commentator for the Play Pokemon Video Game Championship Series. You've probably seen my face on the official streams at some point. I also do a lot of streaming currently, and prior to all of this, I was a fairly serious competitor from 2009 to 2016 was the last time I think I took a IRL tournament seriously. And during that time, I qualified for Worlds once in 2015. That was the last year before they added the championship point bar. And yeah, thanks for having me. I mean, you guys are awesome. Keep it up.
You didn't have to say that.
Yes,
I know, you didn't even pay me to say that.
All right, and of course, our second guest for the week is Chalkey Horenstein. So, Chalkey, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hard to follow a commentator there, so I'll also repeat saying thank you for letting me be here. So I am what the community calls a filthy casual. In earlier years, I did do some tournaments of some renown. Back when you had to qualify for national championships to do that, to compete there, I pulled that off about 3 times, and then qualified for Worlds once after that, and then have a couple top cuts here and there. I think maybe 4 top 8s, if I remember correctly. And then outside of Pokemon, a big reason why I care a lot about this is I'm actually a licensed clinical social worker. Most of my background is in homeless shelter providers and shelter services. Right now, I'm currently working for a domestic violence agency, so I am specializing in not just advocating for a better world, but also just sort of the clinical side of like what happens to people that are hurt by things that probably shouldn't be happening and things where we could be better allies. So really glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, thanks to you guys both for joining us. And just to give an idea, a little bit of where we kind of want to take this podcast is, of course, we really want to kind of talk about, a lot of the way that these issues pertain to VGC. And I think that's especially relevant now with a lot of the things in the Smash community touching very close to home for a lot of people. And we really want to talk about, ways that we can be allies. And I think, some of those sorts of things that we can do to make a positive impact sort of get lost. So those are the sorts of things that we definitely want to talk about with this podcast, to kind of give everybody an idea of, what kind of things go on that you might not know about, or what sort of things you can do to definitely, support victims and make our community a better place. So in preparing for this episode, one of the things that Chalkey talked briefly about is, why does this matter? And this is, something that feel free to correct me, Chalkey, but you said is something that goes into a lot of the inclusivity trainings that you do at work. So why does this matter is obviously kind of at the core of any possible thing that we could talk about on this subject.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have both professional and personal reasons for why being better allies and being inclusive to our women, our people of color, our LGBT friends, but I also have professional reasons as well. Like on the personal side, I've just really loved this game. I love this community, and I have so many happy memories, and I want everybody to be able to have that feeling that this is a safe space where they can express themselves and be happy. And I've seen so many times over the years where players that were very promising have ended up leaving just because we weren't exactly the most supportive around treating women right, or we weren't the most supportive around treating our trans friends right, and that deeply bothers me, especially when it shouldn't happen to anyone, but I've also seen people that are very, very good walk away from the game just because they just did not feel comfortable with the community around them, and that's a terrible feeling when
there was a story
you have so much potential.
Something like that we found out about today, even. Like, I think this morning we found out that someone who top cut Worlds last year, Megan Rattle, walked away from the game because she just didn't feel comfortable. So, I think that's I really agree with that point.
For the New England players, Brendan and I both have played with a woman named Amelia Zoldi who walked away from the game.
Yeah.
And for those who never knew this person, she was regularly top cutting our locals and has top cut regionals in the past as well.
And also she was just a great person.
Yeah. Genuinely sweet. Would never hurt anybody, and very, very good. Like, got championship points at nationals her very first year ever doing that, which is incredible and very difficult for a lot of people to do after several years. And
I mean, I feel like I shouldn't be justifying it this way, but I also remember a match she had. I think it was like maybe 2016 Massachusetts regionals or something.
Oh,
or
yes.
New England
I know
regionals,
exactly which one you're talking about with the Mega Sableye.
Yeah,
oh my god, yes.
And she was playing against Wolf Glick, and I remember that went to like, I think it might have gone to game 3, like to
She
time.
outplayed him, and then
lost,
like
it was
outplayed him.
Crazy. Like, I wish I could remember more specific details about that match, but I truly believe that she could have gone on to be an amazing player if she kept up with it.
She dunked on me in the Nugget Bridge major that I won. Like, she was one of my losses in Swiss, and she just obliterated me.
I believe that was 2015, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
All right.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Right.
So that's kind of at the core of it, right? Is we'll use Amelia as our paragon for today, but really, and I think this is kind of where Chalkey was going, is kind of like, we want to make sure that this community is accessible and welcoming to everybody, regardless of their background. And
I'd say to the people that maybe don't care about this issue right away, but very much care about like things like the prestige of Worlds or like reasonable prices at events. I think all of this plays into that, because if we cannot sustain a growing community and cannot sustain a welcoming environment where people feel safe coming into it, then that's always going to affect things like the prize pool. That's going to affect like locations and accessibility. So this is something that seems like it's only affecting a very small portion of the community, but it's really affecting all of us a lot more than we realize.
Yeah, and I hate to be that person who brings up like championship points payouts, but like, if you think about it, a lot of the championship point payouts last year were all on the sliding scale, where the more people who competed, the more championship points there were available. So if you're someone who was constantly frustrated that, you were missing the kicker for top 32 championship points, for example, having more people is one way to solve that problem. Like, it's such a pragmatic view of a very delicate situation,
Right.
but I feel like a point like that would speak to maybe people who haven't necessarily considered this before, which is why I bring it up.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, as much as we hate to frame it that way, it makes some sense, to people who think in a certain way to frame it that way. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that if that, kind of changes the way that you view things for the better. But obviously, aside from that, we just want to make a place where everybody can enjoy the game that we all like to play together, which is what we'd like to be able to reduce it to. But in absence of being able to do that just yet, there are definitely some things that you can put numbers to kind of support why we should be doing this. So as far as VGC is concerned, at this point, in the stage of our game and our society, we can kind of break it down. Well, maybe not this specific point, but there will be events again. So let's frame it in that
a theoretical
way. There
world
will be events
where
again.
Society is fully functioning again.
Right.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do remember that there are online forums right now where people discuss VGC, and they may or may not happen in real time, and they may or may not be toxic as well. So I think that this is always relevant.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. So, definitely. But like Jake said, assuming a fully functional society, we can kind of break the two sides of VGC down into, the situations where we're having, personal face-to-face interactions and interactions that are kind of, done behind an online, persona, so to speak. So I'm going to start out with the one that's a little bit less relevant to us now, but of course, events are really the thing that are kind of at the very heart of VGC, which is where, we talk to our friends and acquaintances and we compete in live events, which is where, the majority of our prizing comes from, the majority of the prestige comes from. So this really, when it comes down to it, is the core of what our game is. And in the past, and I'm sure we'll get into this in just a bit, but there are people that have walked away from the game because of some poor experiences that they've had at these events when our community hasn't been as welcoming as it could be. So what we'd kind of like to talk about now, and Gabby and Chalkey, if you guys want to touch on any sort of experiences that you felt like you or people that have been excluded or marginalized, and what we can do to kind of change our behavior at these events to be more inclusive.
Yeah. And
Go for it, Chalkey.
Before we jump into that, I always want to give a brief disclaimer that I can talk for my own experiences of maybe racial things that have happened to me, or I can talk about things that I have witnessed, but there's always going to be gaps where someone might experience something that someone else hasn't. So for example, I could tell stories about what women in the community have vented to me about, but I can't say that I know what that's like. And I think the same way, we there's going to be gaps in what we cover in this podcast just by nature. For example, none of us have experienced what it is to be Black in this community, and none of us have experienced what it is to be trans in this community. And I want to make sure that even though we can represent that to a certain extent, we always want to make sure that beyond what you learn in this podcast, make sure that you're listening to other voices as well and amplifying those when need be.
Yeah, very well said.
Cool. So should we just flip open the storybook? And I hate to say it that way because, again, I feel like my way of dealing with this now, after years of just kind of being forced to come up with coping strategies, is through humor. I think that it also makes it more accessible to other people because I have all these funny stories that I like to talk about things that have happened to me or things that I've witnessed at events, and it's easier to sort of swallow them that way as someone who basically, I guess I'll start with more recent stuff. Every time I go on stream, not so much my own personal stream because I have that very much on lockdown, and I'm very fortunate to have found a community of people who are as welcoming and accepting as I would hope that our community would be someday. But like anytime I make an appearance on an official stream, or anytime a woman or a person of color, or especially, you know, someone who may be transgender makes an appearance on a stream, you're just like opening up the floodgates to harassment. I think that it's just something that I've had to come to terms with as a sort of, you know, you take the good with the bad when it comes with being a commentator. There's nothing I can really do to combat it, because at the end of the day, it's like you're trying to silence the anonymous masses, which is quite frankly impossible. And even like, it's not like you go through Twitch chat logs, for example, and see, you know, people saying, "Oh my God, Gabby's so dumb," or "Gabby's so ugly," or "Gabby had my babies," or something. It's more like little like insinuous stuff. I find that a lot of times, especially on Twitch, people like to do something dumb where if they see a woman on the stream, they'll post like a woman emote, or if they see a person of color or a black person, especially on stream, they'll start spamming the trihex emote. I think it's like tryhard or something. And it's just like little microaggressions like that I deal with right now. And that's not great, but because they're microaggressions, and because a lot of people have sort of just taken up this attitude about Twitch chat, like, oh, it's Twitch chat, just ignore it. It makes it easier to swallow. But like going back to my competition days, honestly, the incident that always will stand out to me the most, in terms, not so much in like a degrading kind of way. Those stories I don't really like to think about, because it's just going back to a really bad time, and it's not something that you really want to relive every day. But like, I remember the year that I qualified for Worlds 2015. I actually had enough championship points to get a travel award going into nationals that year. So I believe I was top 8 in the country. Like, it was ridiculous. Like, I remember thinking to myself, like, holy crap, how did this happen? And going into that tournament, I remember thinking to myself, I felt like I had to be like this token, you know, perfect competitor, because I wasn't there as Gabby Snyder. I was there as a VGC woman.
Yeah.
And a lot of my experiences that day, I mean, not all of my opponents. Honestly, it was only like 2 or 3 people, I think, that I had issue with. But like, I would sit down at a table, and it's like you talk to your opponent, you know, maybe they ask, oh, how are you doing? How many championship points do you need to qualify? Like, you know, the usual kind of small talk you make before a tournament. And I was going into a key round. I think I was like X3 at this point or something, knowing that I needed top 128 to get my invite, or lock in my invite for Worlds. And I sit down, and this guy asks me how I'm doing, and I tell him, well, you know, I'm 7th in the country right now. I need top 128. How are you doing? Like, just, you know, honest facts. And he's like, that's not true. And I was like, excuse me?
What?
He's like, yeah, there's no way you're that good. You're lying to me. And I was like, I can get my phone out right now and show you the leaderboard. And he's like, no, I don't want to see it. You're lying. Oh, and wow. It was just this like very dismissive attitude. And I spoke about this to people afterwards. And the take from that situation was that his attitude was fine because he was getting into my head, and that was part of the game. And that's not okay, because I don't care who you are. If that was Wolf Glick sitting down at that table instead of me, or Aaron Trailer, or Aaron Cybertron Zang, or any other Aarons that are gods at VGC, you know, they would have been treated with respect. And I just didn't have that respect, and it put me on tilt. I probably shouldn't have let it get to me that much, but it put me on tilt, and I barely bubbled into top 128 for my Worlds invite that year, and I broke down crying in a group of other women because it was just such a mental battle for me that day.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you about, was the tokenization of women in general, just because I think that's such an issue within video games in general, but like from my experience, even people like, the phrase like, "Oh, you lost to a girl," like making fun of someone for losing to a woman as if they're any better or worse than people like naturally. Like that's just ridiculous. And I was wondering if you had experiences like that, but I no longer have to
Every
wonder.
single tournament. Every single tournament. I mean, a lot of them at this point I don't even remember anymore. But I've spoken a lot on my streams, my personal streams, about just the anxiety that I face when it comes to competing now. And I mean, admittedly, there's probably 50, 100 reasons why I suffer from anxiety. It's a lot of them aren't related, but a large sort of trigger for me is feeling like I have to represent every single person who identifies as a woman who likes Pokemon when I sit down at that table.
Mm-hmm.
And if I lose that game, regardless of the reason, it could be hacks, it could be my opponent just outplayed me, it could be that I just decided to take a nap on the table instead or go get a burger or something, I don't know. Doesn't matter, because if I lose, women lose. Gabby doesn't lose, women lose.
Mm-hmm.
And just to have to deal with that day after day after day, in a game that really does require you to grind out events in order to get to Worlds, in order to have those kind of big accomplishments. Even just day one Worlds, which, I mean, dismissing day one Worlds qualification is a whole other issue that I don't think we want to get into.
Right.
But just like even to get to that point, you have to sit down at that table so many times. I just got sick of it.
Yeah.
And as weird as it is to say, the stuff that I have to deal with as a commentator is so much more easy for me to process mentally than it is to compete. And I still haven't quite figured out why. That's something that I've been exploring recently, especially with all the stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's just better for me mentally, I think that's why I ultimately decided to stop competing, was because I can still show up. And unfortunately, I feel like I still am tokenized to that regard, but it's something that I can deal with. And as a result, it's something that I can sort of continue to show up for, and in a way that's more sustainable for me.
On a slightly lighter note, the burger thing she mentioned ago, that was actually a reference to, in my World's run, a UK player convinced me to abandon one of my rounds because he said it was the best burger he's ever had in his life, and I actually took him up on it.
It was a pretty good burger, too.
That's funny.
But to amplify just how much the cards are biased here, when I did that, there was nobody who judged me as like, well, there were a lot of people that judged me for it, but one of the things that I've observed a lot over the years, and I say this not to talk over Gabby's experiences, but more just to amplify, because I think for someone who is either really sexist or denying that this exists, it might be helpful to see like other men who have seen this as well. But I've seen a lot of times over the years where like if a guy does something stupid in a game, it's treated like, wow, you suck at Pokemon. But if a woman drops a game, it's, wow, women suck at Pokemon. And it's a very harsh standard that comes up a lot. And I also have seen countless times where guys will not even acknowledge that the person might like the game to begin with. So like I've sat at tables and I've seen the small talk next to me where a guy's like talking to a woman and says, oh, are you here to, like, because you are here with your boyfriend, or things like that. Or like either that implication is that they don't respect this person, could be good in their own right, or they're just trying to casually figure out if this person has a boyfriend, which is a whole other problem. But but I've definitely seen a lot of double standards. Sorry, go on.
No, go finish your thought. Sorry,
that was it.
Okay, I mean, Chalkey, you're familiar with this too, because so for those of you who may or may not know, Chalkey and I are engaged. We met
Surprise!
through a Pokemon tournament.
Wait,
their
what?
official announcement is right here, right now.
Oh, okay. Anyways, and there were a lot of tournaments where I was always in a weird spot because people would ask me, "Oh, where's your boyfriend?" And I would be like, "Well, he's over there."
but also, how dare you?
Yeah, it's like, well, yeah, we met through Pokemon, but we met and we bonded. Like, Chalkey wasn't exactly trying to pull the smooth one, like, "Oh, do you have a boyfriend? You want to go get a drink after this or whatever?" No, it was a whole separate thing. And it's always so awkward for me, and I mean, I think, Chalky, you probably understand how this feels now, honestly, because it's like, oh yeah, no, that's the person I'm with, and then people just kind of look at you like, what? Like, no. There was one time someone even mistook Chalky for Aaron Cybertron's name, which was, I mean, in retrospect, hilarious, but also probably an indication of some issues we have
Right.
in the community as well.
I wouldn't exactly call that racist, but I would say this person didn't take enough time in their personal life to meet other Asians to know that there's a difference.
There's in fact
So
more
I
than
will
one.
say, when he asked me seriously if that was Aaron over there, I might have done a bad thing and said yes. And
You absolutely did.
yeah, no, I totally did. And I just want to take this moment to apologize to both Aaron and Chalky, but I still think it's kind of funny.
What's particularly poignant about Gabby in particular experiencing this, like, oh, you're here with your boyfriend thing, is that Gabby has always been a better player than I have. She has top cut more events than I have. She qualified for Worlds in a much harder format. And she was usually the one training me, but the common perception for a long time was that it was the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, now that she's reached celebrity status as a commentator, she gets a little bit of vindication and validation in that I now experience sometimes where a random guy on the street will be like, "There's no way you're dating the Gabby Snyder," and I let it go because this kind of makes Gabby happy because it's nice to be on the other end of that. But unfortunately, not every woman who plays this game is going to have that as a way out of this situation, which is a really frustrating thing.
Right.
And you shouldn't have to justify
Yes.
why you
Yeah.
decided to spend $70 to compete in a Pokemon tournament. I mean,
Mhm.
this isn't cheap. Like,
Can any
I
of us
can
really justify that?
I can understand, back in 2009, 2010, I think even 2011, it was still free to enter. And a lot of people would just start grabbing randoms left and right so that we'd hit CP kickers.
Yeah.
Like, I get that. But nowadays, it's like you have to put so much time and effort and money and travel and vacation time and everything into actually showing up to a tournament. To be in a position where that's just immediately dismissed as, oh, you're just sort of dragged along it's not great. It's not great.
Definitely. So I think it's definitely fair to say that a lot of people have kind of been in the in the situation that Gabby is in the story that she just described, where there are a lot of people in the community that may have any sort of implicit bias, whether or not they are even recognizing the fact that they're projecting those sorts of things onto somebody. So what sorts of things can we do as players, for anybody that's listening to this, to try and sort of combat that sort of behavior?
I mean, I'm going to
first.
just speak from a personal perspective before Chalky goes into clinical mode because he's very good at that. But I think for me, the one thing that always helped me feel better was that being able to have people who did take me seriously and that I could go to after losses and just kind of like word vomit everything that was on my mind, especially if it was with a problematic opponent, and then have them, validate the experience and then say like, yes, you didn't lose because you were a woman, you lost because your rock slide missed or because they flinched you or scald burn or whatever. That was always really helpful with me in coping in the moment. And I know that it can be hard, especially if you're somebody new to the scene, to sort of build that support group, especially since VGC is so cliquey. So honestly, if you sit down and the person across from you, regardless of their gender or, color of their skin, whatever, and they seem nervous or quiet, or maybe they just don't look like they have friends, just be nice to them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, treat them as a human being. Be the person that you wish was there for you, regardless if that person is there or not. It's such a little thing, but just having that moment of humanity in a competitive environment, I feel like is just so, so, so important.
It's honestly kind of sad that we even have to say that, right? Like, be nice to people shouldn't be something you have to be reminded to do, but like...
Yeah, and I'm so glad that Megan released her statement today on everything, because I was honestly sort of partially convinced that it wasn't still an issue. I mean, most of the women that I speak to in the community have, like, stories here and there, but nothing to the scale that she experienced. And I think that's just more evidence that you have to remember that everybody involved with this game is a human.
Yeah.
And you can't just be treating people like trash because maybe they're better than you at a video game. I don't know.
I also just want to chime in about in terms of like what can we do. I feel like we're going to talk a little bit later about how to call people out and kind of how to acknowledge this, but I think just making the attempt to acknowledge, hey, this probably hurt somebody's feelings, or, you know, there are probably other ways we can joke around besides having it be at the expense of somebody else. I think it's really important to have not only like in our minds, but also something we're vocalizing, because I think that a lot of times, even if we can't convince the person that is being problematic, if hearing someone call that out can be so validating. So like if somebody is making racially targeted things at me, even if that person doesn't really change in that moment, hearing somebody else defend me is an instant thing that like lifts my mood a little bit, and it's something that's super helpful just to erase that feeling of like I'm alone in this moment. And going back to just the harassment of women, I think one thing that's really important is that I think I really want guys to take away from this podcast is that everybody who's playing this game is here because they like playing the game. Like if you see a woman who's in BGC, they're not there to get a boyfriend. They're not there to look good. They're not there to look good for you. It's really important just to have the mind that this person's just there to compete the same way you are. And I think that a lot of guys don't really understand just how often women get these advancements all the time, in terms of people just like hitting on them on the streets or on the like in the subway or bus or at work. And it's the stories I hear, and I cannot speak for this experience myself personally, but the stories I hear make it seem like this is a very exhausting experience. And I think that a lot of guys are like, well, I'm just trying to be nice. But the thing is, like, it's not nice when you go through this every single day and you cannot possibly escape this. And I think there's a lot of, I think anybody, be it a woman or anybody else, like everybody's going to have this point where they just want this one thing they can do, where they're just doing it just for them and nobody bothers them, or like they have a break from everything else they experience in the world. And I think Pokemon can be that special place for a lot of people. Stop. That's the end of the sentence. That's the tweet.
I thought my computer disconnected, honestly.
I thought the same thing. I was like, oh man, we lost it. Yeah, I think that's kind of. I think if you'll forgive me for trying to summarize some of the conversations that we're having, is that kind of like we just need to, understand that, everybody is there for a common goal, and it doesn't have anything to do, and not to say so much that we want to set these sorts of things aside, but to play Pokemon, we all do kind of in a way, set some of the things that divide us aside, because we all love the game, and being able to kind of, accept that is present in everybody, regardless of, what their gender or sexual orientation or their race is something that we can all kind of do to make our events more welcoming places for people.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna
go.
Go ahead, Chalkey. Do you want to say one more thing?
Just one little thing. We talked a lot about treating women better in the community, which we absolutely need to talk about infinitely more than the time we have on this podcast. But just one thing that's both in terms of race and sexual orientation and LGBT that I see on occasion, like if there's a tournament where nicknames allowed, just be sensitive about that, and
oh my God,
please don't make the butt of the joke a marginalized community. So like, for example, like there was a tournament, and in this one I'm going to deliberately keep things somewhat anonymous, but there was a tournament I remember where it was a pretty large mid-season, and one of my close trans friends was undefeated in Swiss and going into cut and like guaranteed like just going really strong, and the last opponent before cut was somebody who just had very obviously transphobic nicknames that were just like making fun of transgender idols at the time. And she broke down crying in the bathroom and just going like, am I just a joke to people? Like, it doesn't matter what I do or what I accomplish, I will never be taken seriously. And she lost the next round of cut because she just couldn't stay focused. And it was just a heartbreaking thing where like you had this amazing run, and then this something that's just like just a joke to you can ruin somebody's day. And this could have ruined, like, in the broader context, like, if you were like hypothetically the person that was like one tournament away from your invite, like Gabby was in the story a second ago, and then this is what happened, like, that's to have all of this riding on a tournament where you can't focus because you're just reminded of how much the world doesn't take you seriously. Like, that's a miserable feeling.
Yeah, I will say, one of the benefits of being in my position right now, more so at like the previous regional streams where things were more grassroots than any official productions, is that if I see you having inappropriate nicknames before you go out on stream, I will call a judge. And I highly recommend that if anybody is ever in that situation ever again, that they just immediately go to a judge or immediately go to a TO or a person, come find me. I will go get them for you. Like, just because it is against the spirit of the game now, finally. And that kind of behavior just isn't okay.
Yeah.
To wrap that up in a very quick soundbite, if the only way you can be funny is to make fun of somebody else, you're not funny.
Yeah. Stop trying.
Go home.
All right. Well, moving on to, I think, our second like main overarching topic. Everyone's favorite medium of communication, Twitter and social media in general. Especially in a time like now where we don't really get much face-to-face interaction anymore. A lot of people are taking to social media as more of a way to connect with people. And not that it was never popular before. Like, VGC Twitter has always been like popular, especially after Nugget Bridge shut down. That's kind of the one place that everyone flocked to. But now it's people are spending more time on social media. People are putting more out there just because there's less to do in the real world. And so, there's a lot of things that you can notice on social media that, like might not really be contributing to a positive environment for a lot of people, I fear.
Yeah, I mean, I have some thoughts on this if that's okay.
Go for it.
So my issue with social media, and don't get me wrong, I am just as hopelessly addicted to Twitter and Reddit as the average Joe at this point, is that there's so much content on there that is just unseemingly, like, incestuous when it comes to misogyny, when it becomes being sexist, racist, any kind of, all the ists, really, all the ists. And the thing that always eats at me, and I feel like this ties into your nickname example a little bit, Chalkey, so I just kind of want to build on that, is when you see people who have avatars, clothing items, deck sleeves, playmats, I don't know, Twitter banners, whatever, just like visual content that depicts, women or people of color or transgendered individuals in a comical way or in a sort of demeaning way. Obviously, the easy go-to for this is, portraying women sexually or in sexual situations or, taking a cartoon character, because I hate to break it to you all, Pokemon's not real. Essentially, this is a video game and a cartoon.
Wait, what?
Oh. Okay. Sorry, Chalky. Seeing these fictional characters just being portrayed as essentially, pornographically. There's no other way to put it. And as someone who's struggled with body image and just existing as a woman in the world, like, feeling like you're always seen as those stereotypes is just very grating. And I think that if you are someone who enjoys the social media and enjoys, sharing your pictures that may or may not be explicit, just don't do it on the account that you associate with your VGC play. It's so dumb. Like, I get it. People want to be horny on the internet for whatever reason. I get it. I do. It's just, if you are a person in the community who has a following or is someone who is posting these kinds of images or jokes or materials alongside of your team reports, alongside of, I don't know, oh, hey, I finally caught a shiny whatever, like Pokemon content. It's really hard as a woman to feel comfortable around you because do you see me as a human or do you see me as a sexual conquest kind of thing? I understand that people aren't doing this maliciously. I think that this is an issue with society overall right now, where it's just very, very easy to propagate those kind of images in environments where they probably should not be allowed. But it's just another thing that just adds to this overall air of unwelcomeness that a lot of people face going into an event.
Yeah.
And
if you're someone who's like looking at the community online, trying to figure out if you want to go to a local or if you want to try and compete for the first time, and all you see are, images that are demeaning to you, you're probably not going to want to go.
Mm-hmm. And this is especially true of like the players that are most known in terms of like the CP grind or like known for their performances. If they're the ones that are setting this example, that's going to scare away a lot of people because they're going to be the ones that are most visible.
Yeah, and I want to be...
I think one of the things that a lot of allies kind of don't take seriously is like the times like, what do we do when somebody is being problematic and hurtful, but they don't, it's not that they mean any harm, it's not that they're doing it to target someone as a joke or maliciously, but they just don't know any better, they don't realize how this is hurting people. And I think that if I had to guess, I would say there's a fair number of people that post the content that you were describing, Gabby, that are not necessarily, it's not so much that they do this to antagonize women, but they might just do it because they either like don't see how this could hurt somebody, or they don't see, or they're like, or maybe they just want to post this because maybe like, oh, hey, there's this thing that I like, maybe other people will like it too. And then any sort of validation they might get might make them feel less guilty or alone about like the things that they enjoy. But I think that
I just want to be clear real quick. Like, I'm not saying that this stuff is necessarily bad. And, I think that I really do believe that when these kind of incidents happen, or if someone brings their playmat to a tournament and it's maybe inappropriate, I just think that people don't realize that it can be interpreted that way. I just think that they look at the picture and they're like, this is a pretty picture, I want to share it or something. I truly believe it doesn't go beyond that. Okay, I feel go ahead, Chalkey.
Thank you. I feel like one thing that's not that's only like tangentially related to being a good ally, but I see a lot of guys confide in me that they're particularly lonely or they wish they could get a girlfriend, and they don't understand why women don't give them a chance. And I think that I also see a lot of women look at those people and look at what they post in terms of like sexualizing women, and like in the guy's mind, they think to themselves like, I'm this great guy, why won't women give me a chance? But then what a woman might see in that scenario, or what they have told me in the past that they've seen, is just like, this is somebody who only thinks about women as sex. They only see and if you're not posting about women's rights and you're only posting about just like, here's this extremely sexualized picture, going back to like the thing of like, am I a joke to you kind of a thing, like if it'll be very hard to attract anyone that sees your intent as very little other than just like, this is what you want kind of a thing.
And again, I really just want to reiterate the point that you made earlier, Chalkey, and women don't go to Pokemon tournaments or participate in the video game championship series circuit just to get a boyfriend. I feel like every single story of someone getting a boyfriend or a girlfriend out of VGC has just evolved naturally over time. It's not like they sat down across from each other and then was like, you want a date? Okay, thanks.
One of my closer friends in the VGC community, I'll never forget just a time I saw this woman crying and just like huddled over, and she was telling me just about how like she gets hit on in literally every corner of her life, and the one thing she wants more than anything else in the world is just one, a community where that doesn't happen, and two, some male friends that see her as just a friend and will never hit on her. Like that, and the fact that that is something that was so inaccessible like broke my heart, and that radically changed the way I thought about how I talk to others.
Yeah, one of the big themes I'm seeing in a lot of the accusations that have come out about the gaming community, again, not so much VGC, is just this trend of people being friendly towards one another and having a woman or, I guess, love interest, for lack of a better way to phrase it, just thinking that they have this amazing friend that'll always be there for them, that'll support them at tournaments, they practice together. And then as soon as like a sexual relationship is off the table or any relationship is off the table, that friendship is just over. And I don't think people realize how traumatic that can be, especially if it happens over and over and over again to someone. It's like, who can you trust,
Like,
Right,
clinically
and
speaking, that's very damaging, just because then you have this world that objectifies you, and then you start to see it as because like what that action tells a human brain is like the only thing I'm good for is to be someone's partner.
Yeah.
And that really messes up someone in terms of just like their ability to not only be a good partner later down the road, but it also affects their ability to like have confidence in what they've accomplished. It's a good reason people develop imposter syndrome. It's a very good reason that people struggle with anxiety, and it leads to a lot more than people realize. It's something that I think guys don't really think about because it doesn't really affect them, but it can create long-term damage in the human brain.
Right, and I think specifically as it pertains to, online forums and Twitter and something like that, is that all these damaging things can be very easily projected because of how easy it is for us to just click the like button.
Yeah.
Or how easy it is for us to type, well, it's not 140 characters anymore, but to put, some words down into our computer screen, and there is, enough of a mental distance between this and our Twitter account and things like that, where all these damaging things can be so rapidly propagated with very little effort and very little thought. And all these sorts of like social things that we think about where, you could be somebody that is like the epitome of a positive influence in a social setting or at an actual tournament like we were just able to speak about. But you don't think about some of the effects that clicking the like button can have. Is that we're in a forum where there's miscommunication and over communication, all sorts of different sorts of things where these messages that we're trying to express either get out too quickly or what we're trying to say doesn't make it to the right place, and it's very easy to do something that's very damaging, which I think is kind of where we're getting to. And I think specifically as it pertains to some of the things that Gabby is saying, as it relates to women specifically, is that that's also a very small and marginalized population as it is compared to the sea of men, especially in video games, that exist, and those sorts of dynamics where there's very low effort in approaching how you act on Twitter, and you don't even consider the fact that the same exact tweet that you're liking or the same exact sentiment that you're tweeting or DMing has been done by tens or dozens of people, in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, like, I don't think the recommendation that is being made here is that you don't consume that kind of content. Like, I think that it's human nature to want to consume that kind of content to a certain extent, unfortunately, or fortunately.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, and I think the key takeaway is that just keep it separate. Make an alt account, like, have your name VGC for your Pokemon stuff, and then something 69 or whatever for everything else. Like, just don't cross the beams. Like, at the end of the day, it's not so much the fact that this kind of content exists. I think that that's just something that, as a society, the internet was literally built for.
Right.
It's just that it has a place and a time.
Yeah.
And that time is not a Pokemon tournament or a Pokemon event or anything associated with your Pokemon life.
Definitely. It's kind of interesting that you bring it up on a societal level because that's exactly what it is. But I think we definitely need to make sure that we, take the opportunity to think about it in the context of our game and, the way that it affects some of the people that exist within our community.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, as damaging as Twitter can be, it is an incredibly powerful tool that can be used positively. And as much as we haven't really seen that all that much, it's important to remember, I think, that this is something that, for the same reasons that it can be detrimental to people, it can be extremely positive, is that if you have a following or a platform, it takes very little effort to project, whatever you're thinking or you feel like saying into a wider audience. So what are some of the ways that we can use our voices on social media to do things that are more positive?
Going back to what I was saying before about calling things out, and again, like the hows we can get back to later, but I think, like you were saying earlier, Brendan, for any given joke that's out there for any marginalized community, it's pretty much not original at this point. People have made those jokes over and over and over again, and I think it can be so overwhelming as a minority to see something that is beyond your control and something that's part of who you are made that way, and just to see that one voice saying like, hey, like, this can be really hurtful. Just one comment like that can make such a difference. And
right.
And on that note, more comments. If there are more comments, not scorning the behavior, like reprimanding the behavior or calling it out, than there are actually promoting or normalizing it, that can make a big difference. Because then I think what's going to be a big game changer for like getting back to the frame of VGC and getting into the realm of like, we're trying to build a community here. I think the easiest way for someone to think this joke is more than they can take and more than they can put up with is if they feel like no one's going to have their back when it happens. Because if you feel alone, that's going to make you not want to be there.
And for those, for Twitter literate folks, we call that a ratio.
I also really like the current trend right now. It's kind of sad that it's turned into this, but people writing and sharing their stories via Twitter and then having people reply saying, I believe you, or retweet saying, I believe you. I'm standing with you. If you need me, if you need anything, reach out. I feel like seeing a lot of that recently has given me a lot of hope for this community. And I think that Twitter is a really popular tool in that regard, because seeing that, 100 people replied to your tweet about, something horrible that's happened to you, saying that I'm sorry this happened to you and let me know if I can help you or whatever. It doesn't make you feel alone, to go back to what Chalkey said. It really does bring that feeling of community in. And I think that it's great that Twitter has been sort of being used that way as of late.
One of my favorite ways I see Twitter being used is when people are sharing things like, this is where you can donate. This is where these are people that are fighting the good fight that you can help. Because I think that we have some players in the BGC community that either might be too young or too old to attend protests, or they might not feel safe attending protests, especially like if you're like the specific target or the specific marginalized group that's being targeted at the moment. It's not like the last thing you need is like going to a protest where things might not be safe, or people might misinterpret all protesters as rioters and like kind of escalate things. But there are so many ways we can help racial equity and racial equality and racial justice besides just showing up at protests. And like there's so many places you can donate that are advocating for different policy or advocating for different procedures or different considerations. And then there's also ones that are like super small. Like I've got one that I've been regularly donating to that's just called We Still Gotta Eat. That's basically for people that have experienced so much racism lately that they're just so emotionally drained they can't even like bring themselves to cook. This group is actually like out like providing hot meals for people, which is something I never would have thought of on my own. And there's like groups that like provide therapy for people that have been targets of racial injustice lately. Like there's so many really cool things happening, and I love when people retweet, because there's so many things. Like one of the best things about Twitter is that like the best and worst thing about Twitter is that things can spiral and just have this reach that is not possible on word of mouth or like other platforms. And like the best way to use Twitter for good is to amplify not only the marginalized voices but also the people that are helping marginalized voices. And always remember that when you have any follower on Twitter, be it one follower, be it 1,000, be it 100,000, what you post is what you're amplifying. If you are posting sexualized pictures, that's what you're amplifying. If you're posting, here's a place you can donate, that's what you're amplifying. That's who you are. That's what you represent.
Definitely. And I think you touched on it briefly, Chalkey, is that we definitely, can use this tool. And I think that anytime we talk about Twitter, we have to talk about how it is definitely a dual-edged sword. But looking at it on the positive side is that for some of those sorts of things that you talked about, where if somebody dumps, an info dump where all these links for GoFundMe's or what have you, or, those sorts of tweets that are trying to get the word out of things positively, is that we can use a single click or a single tap to amplify those voices. And it's something that kind of, maybe we don't necessarily even think about in the grand scope of things. But if you think about, if you're somebody like me and you have, 400 followers on Twitter, it's probably less than everybody else on this podcast. But you have just taken the opportunity to press your phone one time and project your message to, several hundred more people. It's incredibly powerful as far as passing on a message that can be used for good. So I think that's definitely something that we should think about. And I know there are definitely those types of tweets that are going around this time. So definitely, I guess be on the lookout for those sorts of things. And you use, I don't want to say power so much, but it is a power where if you have several hundred people that regularly log on to Twitter and read the things that you're saying, you have all this influence that you don't even necessarily think about. So that's kind of like an opportunity for you to use those sorts of things positively, whether or not it is, like Gabby said, to call somebody out. A lot of people can see that you're using your voice to call somebody out and correct a wrong in some respects. Or like Chalkey said, whether or not it's to project, here's this GoFundMe for this group that's doing a lot of great things right now. It's a powerful thing, and it takes so little effort. And again, in the context of Twitter, it also takes so little effort to broadcast things that are very damaging. But on the flip side, we can definitely use that positively.
Yeah, and I just want to +1 that 1,000 times and retweet it and like it, and then 24 hours later
and then quote tweet it.
So
and
thank you. Yeah.
Unretweet it and retweet it. Yep.
Can I print it out and put it on my fridge? Is that weird?
Unfortunately, only one person will be seeing that, so we're gonna stick to retweets here, Gabby. So one of the things that I really want to talk about, and I know this was something that came up in a lot of respects as we were kind of sort of brainstorming what we wanted to talk about on this podcast, and it is definitely more relevant now over the past couple days as like I mentioned, sort of as we were getting started here, that our community is. Some of the things going on in the Smash community hit very close to home. Let's put it that way. And something that we should all and can be doing as allies to some of these marginalized groups is believing victims. And I'm going to kind of step away and let you guys talk about that.
Yeah.
You go first,
I just want to say my piece, and then I'll hand it over for the clinical analysis. Nobody wants to be known as the person who canceled somebody. I hate to say it that way, but it really is that simple. It's very hard to revisit trauma and revisit these painful experiences. I mean, I feel like I've quite frankly been to enough therapy that I've been able to learn how to talk about the stuff that's happened to me for the most part in the VGC community, but not everybody is at that point, and quite frankly, you don't ever have to get to that point. But if you are at that point and you want to tell people and you want to tell your story, you're not doing that for clout. You're not doing that because you really want to cancel somebody or whatever. You're doing it because it's your truth. And I think the one thing that I've been seeing a lot of, I think, in the past, it's happened in the VGC community. It hasn't come up this time around. I'm sort of waiting for it, quite frankly. It's just this idea that, oh, I'm best friends with this person. There's no way that they threatened to kill you or whatever because you didn't want to go out with them. I'm going to defend them until you leave the community. There have been a lot of stuff like that in the past, and like I think that they're definitely like I mean it's so hard to talk about, and I'm probably just going to throw this over to Chalkey because he's a lot better with this kind of stuff than I am. But you, as someone who's coming forward with a story, you certainly can provide proof if you want to, but you shouldn't have to have like receipts of the horrible things that happen to you in order to have people listen and take your story into account.
Mm-hmm.
So this seems like a good time for me to jump in. So
yes, please.
One of the things that I was saying in my introduction is I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and most of the shelters that I've worked for have in some way involved people homeless due to things like domestic violence, and underneath the domestic violence umbrella is very often sexual violence or things like sexual assaults that come into play. The first thing I want to say is that I think a lot of people don't realize how damaging like over-sexualization can be on the human psyche. So like someone who's experienced sexual assault in particular, like they'll go through things like uncontrollable flashbacks. They'll have they can have difficulty with short-term memory loss, difficulty with like prioritizing long-term goal setting because of that, difficulty with like big picture stuff. It can set them, which in turn like sets them back not only in Pokemon but also like in their careers. It can lead to like, panic attacks, disassociation, risk of self-harm, risk of suicide, difficulty like socializing in general, and like just like physical chronic pain. So like there's so much where like if you're like there's so many things where people think like, oh, like, well, I meant well, I just wanted them to know how I felt about them, but like that there's so much more that you're doing, and there's so many things that can never be unsaid that I think a lot of people don't really take into account when they either make them, and this is much proportionally like the things that I essentially like those are all like things that can happen but don't always happen, and if you're like just hitting on someone as opposed to like sexually assaulting someone, it's going to be like a lower grade of that, but these are still things that can happen. Going back to what Gabby described as receipt culture, there's a lot of things that happen, and a big reason why I want to talk about like my experience working with people who have experienced these sorts of things is that I think what a lot of people don't really take into consideration, that's like even beyond just like clinical things, is that like we have this idea that if someone might be only legitimate if they can like prove through like text messages or like messenger receipts or like screenshots of conversations that they were not okay with this. But the reality is that for a lot of people that are being sexualized, they might not necessarily feel safe responding in a way that actively shows their disinterest or their disapproval, because they're most of the time, if somebody is being hit on in this way, it's by someone probably like that is either larger than them, or that person might not be that confident in their own ability of like, could I fend this person off if I needed to, or could I like escape this, or like even beyond physical strength, just like, could I escape this person's internet presence if I really wanted to, or would I have to leave the community? Would there be retaliation? Would there be embarrassment or difficulty communicating? Would my friends take this other person's side? So there's all these reasons why someone physically or emotionally might not feel safe responding in a way that immediately shuts it down. And that muddies the waters a lot in terms of like what those quote unquote receipts will eventually look like. And the other thing that happens a lot is that sometimes, like Gabby mentioned this scenario earlier, where someone thinks that they have this really close friend that's always going to be there for them, but then the truth comes out that they're just interested in them romantically or sexually. And then when that, in that moment before anything else happens, that can be really jarring for a person. That can be, and sometimes they may not process that in the moment, because like what we call fight, flight, or freeze reactions can take place. And so sometimes like they might not shut that down just because they're just catching up with the moment of what's happening. Another thing regarding specifically sexual assault allegations, and this is something I really want the BGC community to take seriously, not just for women that might experience this, but also just because I think that there are so many misconceptions about why someone would do this. And the most common thing that I will hear from not just abusers, but also like very casual bystanders of a sexual assault is like, well, if this really happened, why didn't they go to the police? Why did not go to the justice system? Why drag this man's reputation through the mud rather than go through the legal system? And there's a lot of reasons for that. And this is something that, and I cannot stress enough, I have worked with people and I've had clients that have experienced this over and over and over again for 9 years. And so like most of the time what happens is if people don't even bother reporting it because their family support isn't really there to begin with. So like if their community, so like if somebody is going through sexual assault and they think their closest friends, be it the VGC community or their personal family, won't believe them, they're going to think, the person I trust that trusts me more than anyone else doesn't believe me. Why would a stranger believe me? And then even if they go to the police, most of the time, the way the current police policy and procedure is structured, they don't really have an obligation to hold people accountable for this. So like rape kits are often left untested. They don't really have much. They're very quick to dismiss things as like he said, she said, and if there's like nothing beyond, and especially like if the abuser did this in a way that these two people were the only witnesses, the police can shrug it off, and they don't really lose any credibility. They don't lose any due diligence if they just ignore it at that point. And then even if the police recommends this goes to trial, most prosecutors aren't going to pick up the case because it's a very difficult case to win, and they don't want these losses on their record because that affects like their own careers. And so there's an official statistic that's like 40% of prosecutors are willing to take a given rape case, but in my experience, just like having worked with these clients and advocated for them, it's closer to like 13% for my own personal experience. Now, granted, that is also influenced by the fact that I'm working with low-income populations that aren't very promising to prosecutors in that regard as well. And then even if somebody goes to trial, the survivor's going to have to endure the trauma of having to relive this story and tell this story that's so painful to a whole bunch of strangers. They're going to have a defense attorney who's trying to defend his client by basically trying to attack this person's credibility and their character, and they're going to look for any sort of lies or inconsistencies. And basically, they have to endure this. And not only is that physically and emotionally exhausting, but it's also very financially exhausting. And one thing that happens a lot is that abusers figure out eventually that they don't have to be right to win a court case. They just have to last longer than the person who is right. And so if this person is vulnerable enough where like every time they're in court, they have to take a day off work or find childcare or things like that, then this is going to weigh on them financially to the point where it might be better for their lives if they just drop. And then so there's a lot of times where a woman doesn't see justice. And even if the case is won, there are sentences that are pretty light. And there's always the risk of retaliation the moment the abuse is released. And so, and not on top of that, like, and the only part that we are physically capable of seeing if you're not part of this system is that every moment of this process that I just described, the woman's going to experience harassment, belittlement, threats, internet chats that are just like utterly exhausting. And so there's so much that's going through this. And I think the most common thing I hear guys saying when sexual assault allegations come up is like, why should we believe this person? But then what I want every guy to hear when they hear my story is I want them to think about not from this perspective of why should we believe this person, but more why would anyone lie about this and take it this far knowing that this is what's going to happen. Like and there's this grossly exaggerated assumption that people do this for attention or for revenge, but someone loses so much more by coming forward with the story than they're ever going to possibly gain from this. And I think I think it's very hard for, and I don't say this in the sense that only women are sexually abused and only men are abusers, but I think if you are a guy that has never experienced sexual harassment in the frequency and duration that a woman has, it's very difficult to understand just what's going to happen to someone the moment they come forward. And there's also like a lot of guys that like, and a big problem with, and I swear I'm going to move on after this, but like another thing that's really problematic about the receipt culture is that like the people that are the huge fans of the abuser and will say like, this person's a great guy, they would never do this. They'll look for reasons to find inconsistencies because they want to believe this person they care about could never do such a thing. But the thing is that when you've gone through something that's like really, really traumatic, be it sexual assault, be it even just like the loss of a loved one, or like just like something that can happen to anybody. The thing is that your brain is not functioning at full capacity, and so this affects your ability to make long-term memories. This affects your ability to prioritize in the situation. So sometimes what might happen is like they might tell one version of the story in one moment, and they might tell another version of the story that's slightly different in another situation. And it doesn't mean that the woman's lying. It might just mean they didn't fully process everything in the moment that it happened, or even outside of like traumatic stress responses. Sometimes it's just a matter of like the woman doesn't feel safe telling the whole story, because if they tell just a little bit, maybe someone's more likely to believe it. And so there's so many reasons why asking for a receipt does not accomplish the thing people think it does. Like there's this whole concept that if we have this irrefutable, we just need irrefutable proof. But the thing is that there are so many reasons why things can be twisted out of context that more often than not, it doesn't really help. And I think there's, going back to what you were saying and just coming back to the main theme of this particular section, the best thing you can do as an ally is take this seriously and believe someone. It does now, and that doesn't necessarily mean like, I know like the first thing I hear when I tell this to guys is like, oh, so we should just believe every woman who does this. And to that I say like, you should always take it seriously at the very least, and you should always be willing to show this person, I'm willing to listen to this, and I'm willing to work towards making sure this can't happen again. And you don't have to necessarily believe someone to support them. I mean, you should still believe them if this is, because like I said, like there's so many rings people have to go through before they hit the point where they're willing to come forward, that it is very clinically unlikely that someone would take something this far out of a lie. There's just too many things that happen in the system that would make someone want to stop sooner.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, to put it lightly, it's a very complex issue, but I think I'm gonna not try to really summarize or elaborate on this at all, because I think you really nailed it, Chalkey. Is and like we kind of mentioned throughout the show tonight, is that it's a uniquely relevant issue, especially for a lot of people in the community. I know there's a lot of overlap, without a lack of a better word, for between the Smash community and the VGC community. There are people that are pretty heavily involved in it. But kind of as Chalkey said, I'm just not even going to try to elaborate. Like why are we not believing these people, I guess, is what it comes down to.
Just imagine what it would feel like if you were telling the truth and nobody believed you about this horribly traumatic thing that happens. Like, just imagine what that has to feel like. But
yeah, and it's tough too, and I think it's at least from my perspective, I try my best to try and project myself into those sorts of things, but it's incredibly difficult, and I kind of find myself just at the end of the day thinking, like, instead of trying to project this, I just have to think about, like, like why would we not? That's kind of the best I can do for myself, and I know everybody has their own way of processing things, and that's kind of the way that I do it. But it's tough to watch, or what people call it, putting on their comment goggles and diving into the comments and those sorts of things. But it's hard to watch a lot of those sorts of things. But I really feel strongly about giving these people the benefit of the doubt, if nothing else. Anyway, sorry. Were you wrapped up there, Chalkey? Is there anything else you want to kind of leave us with that in that regard, or
I mean, for the most part, I'm done. I mean, I guess the big point I was trying to make is that, like, I hear so much about, like, why didn't someone go to the police, or why are they coming forward in this way?
Right.
And I think the big thing I want people to understand is that the legal system it's not that the legal system bad, because we need it to exist, but the legal system's not always equipped to handle something that is of this nature. And I think that it is very, very difficult for someone to get justice in this way. And more often than not, if someone's coming forward with abuse, it's not because they want to drag this person's reputation to the mud. It's because they want to make sure that other people know this can happen and feel safe. Or to know that this happens to other people, and so that someone who is secret about this doesn't feel that much more alone.
Right, and I think before we kind of move on, I think it's sort of important. I think for a lot of us, it's hard to place ourselves into the context of the legal system, which obviously is kind of where a lot of these things stem from. But you can almost look at some of these situations that are sort of happening on the internet as like a microcosm of the way that things sort of play out in the legal system. And I think maybe that's a good way to frame it in a lot of respects, is that people that are, like apologists for a figure or a type of behavior are kind of like feeding into the problem that exists at a much grander scale, where it has much more far-reaching consequences. So I guess that's something to think about. Is at least how I'm gonna frame it for myself right now. So, so we're gonna move on to one more thing, and I know this is kind of sort of the last little piece that we want to talk about, and I know it was something that we all kind of felt pretty strongly about, and it sort of ties together the other kind of three large sort of talking points that we worked within for the purpose of this podcast, where we're talking about behavior at events, and I think Gabby touched on it at some point during that, and then social media and believing victims. Is that as far as allyship goes, one of the very easiest things that you can do, and I think this is one of the ways that Gabby put it when we were talking about it right before we started recording, is it's really easy to, with a little bit of education and information at your disposal, to recognize this type of behavior and call it out. And it takes very little effort in a lot of respects. On Twitter, sometimes it's as easy as the retweet button. But the important piece of it that we wanted to talk about here is that it can be a situation where you have to call out the behavior of your friends. And that's something that, we're all, in this community, and a lot of people like to try and support each other, support their friends in the community. But it's important as part of, our quest for allyship to try and recognize this type of behavior, even in people that are our friends, and to call it out when it presents itself.
Yeah, and I think even beyond like anything clinical that I could add, it's almost common sense that you're more likely to listen to someone that means you well, and you're very psychologically unlikely to listen to someone who's just yelling at you and that's your only relationship with the person. So it's so important to start with your friends. If you see a close friend of yours doing something that's going to hurt others, you need to be the one to call it out, because they're more likely to listen to you than a total stranger.
Yeah.
And
one...
you go first,
ahead.
Gabby.
No, go ahead.
In terms of just one of the things you can do in terms of how to call out people well and how to be a good ally, I think the one thing that I see a lot of good intended but also slightly problematic allies doing is, like, if the only thing in your arsenal is to yell at somebody or to like berate them for doing problematic behavior, it's not always going to work. And like I said, what person's going to want to listen to someone that only is in their life to call them out? And I think that there's so much about changing the hearts and minds of people that revolves around building rapport with someone first and trying to figure out where they're coming from. And like, this is very much like the social work way, that you have to meet people where they are. And I think one thing that I really hope people will take away from this podcast, and I keep saying that I have so many things I want people to take away from this podcast, is I think a lot of people are very quick to give up on any sort of social justice cause because they think that a given person is incapable of change. And they'll say, like, it's not worth our time reasoning with this person. They're not going to listen to reason. And I think that some of the best social work techniques, like clinically speaking, come from this guy named William Miller. And the history behind this guy is that he joins this addictions counseling group right out of his master's program. And basically everyone who initially got there was telling him, like, nobody here wants to change. They can't change. Just come in, get your hours, qualify for something bigger, and then move on. Don't get invested here. And what he found was that most of the people there actually very much wanted to change. It's just that the circumstances weren't lining up the way that they needed to. And if you're having trouble as an ally trying to fight the good fights, and you're finding that people aren't resonating, the best, like, one really quick and dirty social work technique I can give you is what's called the DARN model. So think about don't think about someone whether they're capable of changing. Think about what's preventing someone from change. And the DARN model stands for desire to change, like do they physically want to, ability to change, whether they physically can and whether they personally believe they can change, reason to change, which is do they think this is the most logical thing for them to do? Like, is this something that's logical to them? And then need to change as in a sense of urgency. And so reason and need kind of get easily confused sometimes because like someone might mix up those two. So like an example in the social work field is that someone might have the need to change if their income's not high enough to sustain themselves, but might not have the logic and the reason to change if like the job that's most immediately accessible is going to put them in what's called the cliff effect, where they make just enough money to lose all of their benefits and end up having a lower take-home pay than what they did before, or they might have just enough where they lose benefits but not enough to survive on their own. In the context of BGC, the ability one is one that I think a lot of people don't take seriously, because sometimes when people make problematic jokes, it's not because they actually mean this person harm. It's that they themselves are looking for acceptance. They themselves are looking for validation and connection with others. And these jokes might be the only way they found connection with others. They might have, like, they make people laugh in ways that they couldn't before. And I know, like, you don't want to enable or justify the behavior, but it's a very human and relatable thing to ask someone, like, could you do this? Could you connect with people without making fun of others or hurting others or hitting on others? And I think that there needs to be a certain level of empathy to the fact that there are going to be some problematic people that it's not that they mean harm, it's that this is just the way they survive. And you have to find ways to not just make things better for the marginalized, we also find what are things in the system that are making people so unwelcomed that they have to resort to this to feel welcomed or to feel accepted. And we really need to think about that too. And nobody really wants to think about how do we make things better for abusive, problematic people, but we kind of have to if we're going to make this cause work. And to wrap up the DARN model thing, I think the biggest issue I see in good intended allies is that they think someone's incapable of change, but when they really should be thinking about what specifically is preventing the change and exploring from there. Like, what are the things that are making it difficult for this person to change, and really exploring that with the person. And some of that is only going to become apparent if you have a connection with the person, if you're building rapport and really putting the time in. And like you said, calling out your friends first. Granted, that's going to be harder for people that don't have a lot of friends, but we work with what we have.
Yeah, and honestly, the only thing I want to add to that is when calling out your friends, I just want to say that anybody who does that, regardless of, what exactly you're calling them out on, whether it pertains to this conversation, whether it pertains to some of the other injustices that are circling the world right now, it's a tough conversation, and it's a conversation that you don't always get a immediate reward out of, because you, as the person who is calling them out on their behavior, are 9 times out of 10 not a part of the marginalized party, because you are in a space where you feel safe calling them out on that. So I just want to take this time to say, thank you. Like, I know that it's hard. I know that no one likes to have those kind of conversations, especially with your friends, especially when there's so much going on in the world right now that just makes everything else seem that much harder to do. But it's really important, and it's the only way that we can make change. So
I really want to echo one thing you said in particular, which is that we need people besides the marginalized calling this out, because I cannot tell you how many times I've tried to sidebar with someone about something that happened, and a very common defense I hear is, if they had a problem, they should have said something. Or they'll say, like, I think you're making a bigger deal out of this than ever. Like, look, they're fine with it. And the thing is, like, if you're somebody that is constantly hearing things at your expense from every part of the community, you might either not feel physically safe calling it out, or like peer pressure alone might compel you to want to put up with this. Like, I cannot tell you how long in my young life I put up with like Asian jokes, because I thought that if I called out every single person that was making these kinds of jokes, I wouldn't have any friends left. And that's a very demoralizing feeling. So there's going to be certain times where I need the white cis hetero people to call this out, and there's going to be times where we as men are going to need to be the ones to step up and call out our fellow men.
That's something I agree with like very strongly. Like over the past month or two, with like one example is the Black Lives Matter movement. Like I feel like that's something that I, as a white person, never would have connected with originally until I started hearing, more support for this movement from people outside of it. And then I realized like this is what like our responsibility is as people that I guess specifically in terms of Black Lives Matter, like as a white person, it is my responsibility to, kind of try to change this like overall structure of society where the white people are always the ones, advantaged in some sort of way. And I think, at this point, sitting idly by and just letting things happen just isn't an option anymore. And that's what's been like driving me in terms of trying to like contribute to that kind of movement. And I think you can easily say the same thing, just for one example within VGC, like the discrimination against and harassment of women. Like the men in the community need to step up and be the ones calling out people because, as shitty as it is, like those are the people that will be the ones to make the impact first. Like the popular people, the people that have this perceived power within our community have to be these ones that are making this change so everyone else might jump on board.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I think a lot of the people in my personal Twitter bubble have been doing a good job of that recently, but it's not you can't just be the people who call or the person who calls someone out when it's like the cool
right
cool
when
thing
everyone
to
else
do,
is doing
so
it,
to speak. Like, yeah, you have to keep this up for a very long time, in theory, until it goes away, which I mean, I would hope that there's an end date for that in sight, but you can't really say, So if there's one thing that you add to all the other things that we've asked you to take away from this conversation, it's just please don't stop. Like, just please. It's a long road, but I every time I see someone, sort of call someone out, regardless if it's the cool thing to do or not, it does give you a bit of hope, and it does show you that things are slowly changing. It's only been 4 years since 2016, and I feel like the conversations we're having today are way more productive than the conversations about this we've had 4 years ago. So if that's the one thing that we've gained since then, that's great. Let's just keep on going. Let's keep adding one more thing and just keep being there for each other as a community.
And don't stress about the big picture of just like the idea of eliminating all racism or the idea of eliminating all sexism is very daunting. And so first of all, we don't need one perfect ally. We need a million imperfect allies. Second of all, it's going to seem like an impossible, demoralizing task if the goal is like get rid of all sexism in the community. But your efforts in this moment, it's not necessarily going to change the entire world, but it can change one person's entire world.
Right.
I don't know though. I think this podcast has pretty much ended sexism once and for all, right? Like, I think we did it.
Congratulations.
That's the man.
Oh.
We did it, everyone. Let's wrap it up. Right. So I think Gabby started to kind of segue into it, but one of the things that I kind of wanted to do in a way of sort of wrapping up this episode that we're doing here today is to try and like kind of project, not to try and summarize everything, but maybe think of one thing that we talked about today and kind of bundle it into your one big takeaway from this episode. And I think we could sort of use this in the context of Twitter.
Yeah, if we had one tweet.
Where like when everything needs to be digested in 280 characters or less. What is like a tweet that you could make to really give anybody that's listening to this something to take with them?
For me, I would say both as an ally trying to work with people and as someone who will occasionally get called out, the big takeaway I want people to have is just because something is simple for you to understand doesn't mean it's going to be simple for everyone else.
For me, it would be as simple as believe women, believe victims, and show your support where you can.
Mine would be if you are ever targeting a person because of their identity, like any part of who they are, whether it be gender, race, orientation, anything like that, that is never okay. Like, calling someone out for their identity is just demoralizing and terrible. And I think that kind of encapsulates a lot of the issues that I personally perceive. So let people be themselves.
And I think for me, and it's something that I'm personally trying really hard to do, is just kind of listen to marginalized voices. And I think they're kind of something, they get washed away sometimes. And you, as, a person, especially if you're in some position of privilege, have the opportunities to both take in and then amplify those voices with the right platform. Okay, so I think we did our best to approach these sorts of really difficult conversations, and then hopefully kind of wrap them up into ways that you could both understand and also kind of apply to your practices, because this is a game that is great in a lot of respects, but also has the potential to be so much more than it is if we bring everybody on board with some of these causes that are extremely important, and are very much rising to the forefront of conversation right now. And we sort of talked about some of the reasons that it might benefit us to do that, some of the reasons it will benefit some of the marginalized communities to do this, and I think hopefully we've presented it in a way that both speaks to you and gives you sort of a plan of action.
Yeah, and I really want to say, like, the things that we're describing here, I don't want anyone's takeaway from this to be the VGC community is terrible. What I want people to really think about is that the VGC community can be something that's so magical and so powerful and something life-changing. And the only thing I want is that I want every single person to be able to have that experience, not just the ones that currently do.
That's awesome. Well, if you guys have any final thoughts, by all means, I'll give you the floor for just a sec. But if not, I'm getting ready to transition out here.
I'm taking so many final thoughts. I apologize.
Yeah, it's a lot of final thoughts.
And
one
one
won't
more
hurt. Just
thing.
reiterating something I
Please,
said
please,
before.
please.
Reiterating something I said before. If the only way you can be funny is to make fun of someone, you're not funny.
Yeah.
Branch
yeah,
out.
I think
Branch out. Try new things.
Yeah. That's a great way of putting it. It's like those comedians that are like, if you have to swear to be funny, you're not funny.
Yeah.
All right, so we're gonna wrap up this portion of the podcast here, and of course we want to give a big thank you to Chalkey and Gabby for coming on. We felt pretty strongly about who we wanted to have on this podcast because they are people that are both very ingrained in the VGC community, and also have a really good understanding of some of the social dynamics that exist in the world right now. So thank you both very much for coming on. We really appreciate you coming with us on this podcast to talk about some things that are really difficult.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Thank you. I mean, I've been using my platform where I can to have these discussions, but every additional platform, being able to reach out to more people is really appreciated. So thank you.
Awesome. So again, thank you guys so much. We're going to take just a short break for a couple of seconds, and Jake and I will be back in just a minute to wrap this episode up, so stay with us. Hey guys, welcome back. Thanks for sticking with us through the brief intermission there. And thank you so much to everybody that tuned into this episode. It was something that, meant quite a lot to Jake and I, and I think we talked about it a little bit already, but we struggled with how the best way to do it would be, and I think, I hope, especially for everybody that's listening to this, we found a good way to do it in a way that makes sense to you, and is also kind of delving into some of the deeper issues that are sort of surrounding it, because we feel pretty good about, the way that we were able to kind of take this sort of idea and run with it, especially in a very socially sensitive time in the world right now.
Yeah, this is a conversation Brendan and I have had with each other just in private a lot. And it's something that we felt strongly enough about that we thought, we should probably come out of retirement and maybe talk about this with some people that know their stuff. So, big thanks to Gabby and Chalkey for, coming on this journey with us. They were both incredibly insightful and had perspectives that neither of us could have provided, which was really important for us. So we wanted to make sure we could include more voices than two white dudes.
Definitely. And like Chalkey kind of mentioned a couple of times, there are obviously some voices that were not represented on this podcast. So if you have anything that you really want us to talk about, tweet about, or kind of address in any way, we encourage you to find either of our personal accounts on Twitter, find us at the Soundproof account, tweet directly at the account, any way that we can sort of help some of the causes and boost up some of these marginalized groups the best that we can. We're trying our best to be allies in the way that two American white men can. So if there's anything that we can do for you, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we'd be definitely happy to do our best for you all, because at the end of the day, we all just want a more inclusive and dynamic and exciting VGC community. We need all of you to do that.
Yep.
And before we kind of end the week here, one thing that we did kind of want to draw your attention to is that this is actually either to the day or very close.
It'll be to the day when it's uploaded. Yeah.
To the 1 year anniversary of Soundproof.
Yay!
So we're really excited about this. It's still, is just a passion project for us, and of course we have kind of taken sort of an indefinite hiatus at certain points over the summer. Which hopefully you understand.
Yeah.
It's kind of a difficult time. Obviously, Jake is working on his master's. I work directly in healthcare with COVID positive residents, so it's been kind of a tough time for me as well. So hopefully you forgive us. We have a mind to try and produce these a little bit more regularly, but some of the obstacles that we have in the way are a little bit more than we're able to overcome sometimes. So hopefully for now, you'll accept that we were able to kind of get what we feel is a very important episode out into the world.
Yeah. As always, you can find our Twitters at Soundproofcast for the podcast, at Mr. BDog46VGC for Brendan, at MajorBowman_ for me. Please let us know, like Brendan said, anything else you might want us to talk about, any topics, whether they be social or Pokemon related. Clearly we are not just limiting ourselves to talking about tournaments anymore, which I think is a good thing. But thanks again for listening. Thanks for sticking around for a year of Soundproof. That's really exciting.
A year.
I know! Hopefully there'll be at least one more year to come. So stick with us. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, it's my main source of income at this point, so we've got to keep it going.
Oh, you're getting paid for this?
No, I'm not.
Interesting.
But yeah, thanks you guys so much for tuning in. We'll do our best. But first and foremost, thanks for listening to this episode. We really appreciate it. So stay tuned. You can find us on our all socials like Jake just said, and we love you all. Please try your best to be a good person, especially on the internet right now.
And we will see you next time.